Thank you, Neil. Namaste, ladies and gentlemen. When I was asked to chair this event and started doing my research, I knew very little about sex work. I knew very little about sex workers, and I had limited views about their work, about the circumstances surrounding the choices they make to work in this industry. I'm not an expert. I'm not an academic. Nor do I have any experience of sex work or related activities. However, I have researched, discussed, debated, and argued the points with myself and others, and I am still unsure about what the right course of action is. So, why are we debating this topic today? We fundamentally believe that the Hindu identity values go beyond scriptures, temples, and rituals. Hindu values have a clear role in the shaping of a future society in the UK. These types of manthans, where the debate forces us to reflect, question, challenge, and contemplate Hindu values, actually helps the Hindu society awaken themselves. It helps us to churn out the nectar in our values, to help ourselves navigate through life and help society. I have learned from my research the sex industry to be a very complex and diverse industry. We can say we don't like sex work. We don't like the idea of sex work. We think it's immoral, it's unethical. We can say it's somehow harmful to people. It's degrading, but this is not a question whether we like or don't like sex work. This is about whether we value human rights, dignity, respect, justice, and personhood, and whether individual choices to work in any chosen industry should be criminalized. Since the mid-1980s, the debate about how to address prostitution legally has become a subject of legislative action. Some countries in Europe, most notably the Netherlands and Germany, among others, have legalized and or decriminalized systems of prostitution, which includes decriminalizing pimps, brothels, and buyers, also known as customers or johns. Other governments, such as Thailand, legally prohibit prostitution activities and enterprises, but in reality tolerate brothels and the buying of women in commercial sexual exploitation, especially in its sex tourism. Sweden has taken a different legal approach, penalizing the buyers while at the same time decriminalizing the women in prostitution. Today, ladies and gentlemen, we are debating about consenting adults engaged in sex work. For the purposes of this debate, the term sex work is used to mean the exchange of sexual services involving sexual acts between consenting adults for some form of remuneration, with the terms agreed between the seller and the buyer. We will also discuss the laws, as Mr. Neil Bannister has already mentioned, discuss legal terms surrounding the sex work. What does criminalization mean? What does legalizing sex work mean? What does decriminalizing sex work mean to the sex workers? We are not debating trafficking of women, underage sex work, nor child prostitution. Fears over human trafficking and child abuse should not be dismissed lightly. But laws against both exist and should be strictly enforced. Any kind of exploitation in any work should not be tolerated. No one should be exploited economically or otherwise to benefit someone. Some prostitution facts of interest. There were 60,879 prostitutes in the UK in 2009 who had an average of 25 clients per week, each paying an average of £67.16 per visit. 1 in 10 British men say they have paid for sex. I think we can very safely say it would be 5 in 10. Yes? Okay. 50% of women in prostitution in the UK started being paid for sex acts before they were 18, while 95% street prostitutes are problematic drug users. About 17,500 men pay for sex each year in Northern Ireland. Only about 20 people still work as street-based prostitutes. The majority advertise online or work from houses. The statistics are from the Office for National Statistics, University College London, Home Office, and the Queen's University, Belfast. So, some rules for tonight, ladies and gentlemen. We are here to explore a complex social problem. We are not here to debate, argue, or solve the problem. We are here to manthan. Manthan means churning of ideas. The rules of engagement are, your questions and statements should be short and brief to 1 minute. I'm sure that a topic like this, like all which are manthans, will provoke emotions. Our job is to remain polite, courteous, and open-minded. I'd like to introduce Dr. Nanda, who will now explore the topic from a Hindu civilization perspective, followed by Ms. Lee, who will give us an insight into her work and experience in the industry and her view on current law regards to sex work.
So I'm going to spend about 15 minutes just to explain a civilizational perspective, a Hindu civilizational perspective on this particular issue. And before I get into that, I want to explain why I'm standing here in the first place. My background is political philosophy and I studied liberalism, but that doesn't qualify me to speak about civilizational sexual morality. The reason why I'm here is because as a Vichar Manthan team, Nilaji has been leading this for about 12 months, and we as Vichar Manthan team, we don't shy from trying to contact academics, whether they're in the States, Australia, Tasmania, India, you name it. If we think they can speak about this earnestly, we will try and either project them or get them here in person. And what we discovered was really interesting. We discovered that there are very, very few academics, and academic research particularly, in the area of sexual morality when it comes to a civilizational approach, especially a Hindu civilizational approach. Very little research. The few professors we did find that could articulate or did have research and have conducted research on this, sadly, some were not available for this particular day, and the two that were, English was their third language. And so they would have really struggled to communicate with you with any sort of proficiency. So it fell upon me to sort of speak with them, read books, and I've got a whole heap of books there with me in case any of you throw a googly at me. Effectively, I've had to construct, with their help, a civilizational approach to this particular issue. So the first point that I have to clarify before I start is that in no shape or form am I representing Hinduism. In no shape or form. What I'm trying to portray is a picture of the past as accurately as I can in 15 minutes, and trying to create a earnest attempt at creating some sort of Dharmic lens through which to study this particular issue. That's what I'm attempting to do. So you must forgive me if I if you feel that I end up portraying Hinduism in some way which you may not be comfortable with or you may not agree with. That's fine, but that's what a manthan is for. The other thing that I have to explain is that the way in which you can decipher from a classical civilizational perspective is you have to look at the scholarly works, you have to look at manuscripts, you have to look at written evidence as to what our ancestors left behind, documentations and scholarly pieces of work and poetry and etc., pieces of art. So a couple of things is that the only way you can decipher the civilizational approach when it comes to sex work is to look at sexual morality. So if we just break that down, sex is a given, okay? Sex is a part of human nature, it's part of the human condition. And I don't have any more reason to justify that, because I don't think we'd be here if sex was not a driver of human nature. So that is there. But morality. Morality is the underlying principles upon which a society discriminates between right and wrong, good and bad behavior. It's the underlying principles upon which a society discriminates between good and bad behavior. So you have to look at sexual morality of a civilization in order to understand their subtle nuances and attitudes and values to these sorts of issues. So I will be talking about sexual morality, and then it is our job collectively to muntin it out, to figure out what the values of that would be in a 21st century Britain context. So now, having cleared up all my caveats, I should start somewhere away from Hindu civilization. Let me start a little bit at a different location. Mesopotamia, the middle world, between two rivers. Some really interesting facts you should know. So in Mesopotamia, between 800 BC and the 1st century CE, women generally married very late. Women married in their 30s. And a lot of women didn't marry at all in that civilization, in that time. And so a lot of women used sex as a transactional commodity to survive. Women commoditized sex and made a living off it. And it was very common in Mesopotamia. Now, we have lots and lots of scriptural, written, poetic evidence in Mesopotamia. But the way they did it was interesting. The way in which the society got around that issue was that they created really sophisticated religious ceremonies, religious rites, particular days of the year, where women who were making a living out of this would essentially get the priestly class in a temple setting to do elaborate ceremonies. Through those elaborate ceremonies would be an opportunity for people to pay the women for sexual intercourse. But the viewpoint of that society was that by having sexual intercourse with women in that time, in that place, in that environment, in that sexual rite, they themselves would be purified. So it had a religious garb, it had a religious lexicon to this particular issue. So the Mesopotamians dealt with it in that way in classical times. The Greek world, between the 5th century BC and about the 2nd century CE, brothels were legal business. We see brothels being scattered all the way across the Mediterranean coast, and we know that men in Greek society married very late. We know that men married predominantly when they had to finish, when they dropped out of military service. So by the time men dropped out of military service, they were well into their 30s. So therefore, and in Greek society, it was wrong, it was immoral to engage in sexual activity unless you're married. So the only way Greek society dealt with the human condition, that is the desire for sex, is to allow brothels, to legalize brothels. In fact, we have scrolls from several centuries, spanning over several centuries, of politicians in Greek society debating and arguing about how we should equalize prices across brothels, across the Mediterranean. So this was clearly an open element in Greek society. And you can see why the Greeks circumvented societal pressures, but still keeping their moral or morality, their civilizational morality intact. The other interesting thing about both Mesopotamian and Greek societies was that men and women not only engaged in sexual transactions, but they were both involved in selling sexual gratification. So it was not just gender specific. It was It was men and women. So now let me swiftly come on to Hindu civilization. Now Hindu civilization is, for those of us who are interested in this and those of us who read a lot of scholarly work when it comes to Hindu history, we will realize that you can't go 5 years without completely rethinking Hindu civilization. Because every single year, scholars are translating something like 27,000 untranslated scrolls that are sitting somewhere in Delhi, being eaten away by insects. But these are scrolls that are thousands of years old, untranslated, because we simply don't have enough scholars to translate them. But every year they're being translated. And every year we're discovering new things about how the Hindu civilization functioned, their approaches, their attitudes, their understanding of the world, etc., etc. So every few years, people's perspective changes. And there is very little work being done relatively on Hindu civilization compared to the Greeks and the Mesopotamians. Having said that, there are some excellent scholarly pieces which are in public domain, which I recommend any of you to go and study. One of the most prominent is the Earth Shastra. Earth Shastra is written by a scholar called Kautilya around the 4th century BC. Some like to call him Chanakya. He was the chief economist of Chandragupta Maurya, who essentially founded the Maurya Empire. Now the Mauryan Empire around the 4th century BC, for those of you who know some of your history, was the largest connected empire in Asia. It was bigger than the Roman Empire by a long way. Roman Empire didn't even exist back then, but when the Roman Empire got as big as it did, the Gupta Empire was still bigger. And the Gupta Empire at that time was probably was the superpower of its age. So when you study the Earth Shastra, really interesting things come out. This is not a book on scripture. This is not a book on religious hymns or poetry. It is, a treatise on economy, warfare, social norms, sexual morality. And there's a whole section in the Earth Shastra on sexual morality. So, a couple of things that come out of the Earth Shastra, and it gives us an insight into what Chanakya and his contemporaries were shaping in the Gupta Empire. We discover that there were 3 types of sex workers that were recognized in the Gupta Empire. Some were classed as courtesans of the rich. So we know that rich men and women kept courtesans in their household as a way of sexual gratification beyond their wives or their husbands, who they saw as a way of having progeny. So you will find straight away there's a different mindset happening at that point. But that's only for the rich. Then there were the independent sex workers, and they were functioning out of the city-states. The Gupta Empire was a collection of city-states spanning thousands of miles. And outside of the city-states, the law was not so strong, and these were independent sex workers who were often not regulated, etc., etc. But you do have mentions of them and how they were functioning. But the vast majority of sex workers in the Gupta Empire were they worked in state-owned brothels. Therefore, it was fully legalized. The state itself was taxing sex workers and the brothel owners. The state itself was giving grants to women to manage, employ, train, and look after sex workers when they stopped being sex workers. So there was almost like a pension scheme. And you actually see this written down quite clearly in the Earth Shastra throughout this time. The other interesting thing is the entire issue of sexual morality, and specifically sex work, fell under the Ministry of Entertainment. Not under the Ministry of Justice or anything like that, but under the Ministry of Entertainment, along with the dancers, the courtesans, the actors, and etc., the dramatists. So some really interesting things there. There was no word in Hindu civilization for prostitution. There's no word. The closest we've got is, and literally translated in English, is sellers of beauty. These people were classed as sellers of beauty. Now, some really interesting things come out of this, which I will share with you. There's a wonderful book by A.S. Altakar, a Maharashtrian scholar, and he wrote a book called The Position of Women in Hindu Civilization, from pre-Vedic times to present. Really interesting read. And something really fascinating comes out when you study Hindu literature across times when it comes to sexual morality. And I want to share 3 points with you. And I think these 3 points, if we can keep these 3 points at our forefront of our mind, I think they might help us in some way navigate through this issue that we have in the 21st century with our values. So number 1 is that you find that society, Hindu society, has ebbed and flowed over thousands of years. And it's really interesting. Hindu society, there is absolutely no doubt, has gone through from being very, very oppressive and suppressive and being very strict on sexual morality, right the way through to being absolutely decadent and liberal and hedonistic, I would argue, at some stages. So Hindu society, you can find throughout thousands of years of scripture, of recorded history, that Hindu society was not some static society. It has evolved, and it ebbs and flows, and several times it became really conservative and orthodox, and several times it became very decadent and hedonistic. And so it's been in a swing. Society always swings, ebbs and flows. So we should understand that society is a transient organism. It is not something static. The second thing is, Hindu society has always ran on the principles of dharma. Now dharma, the best way to translate it, and time is running out, is that dharma, literally the word means that which sustains, that which upholds life, the universe, whatever level you want to go at it, metaphysics or practically. So dharma is those set of principles which allow the individual and the society to flourish. Therefore, anything which allows the society to flourish is dharmic. Anything which is regressive or regressive towards society or the individual is adharmic. So how was dharma used? And this is really fascinating. So effectively, the idea is this: if the individual can live in harmony with dharma, he or she will flourish in consciousness, in awareness, in life. He or she who lives in disharmony with dharma will suffer, will regress, will exist on a base level of human consciousness. So there's a wonderful analogy I want to share with you, and this is a really useful way of understanding how Hindu society has ebbed and flowed. Suppose there's a river, and the river is a fast-flowing river full of water. And that water, for this analogy, is artha and kama. Artha is wealth and power, and kama is pleasure. And let's suppose, just for the argument's sake, for the analogy, that sexual morality falls under kama. So in Hindu society, Hindu society accepts that kama is a part of the human condition. We've never escaped it, we never will. It's a part of the human condition. It is something to be managed. So, dharma are the banks of that river. Dharma is the thing which is meant to channel that energy of kama through time. Now, let's just push that a little bit further. When Hindu society, if a society, not just Hindu, if a society becomes too regressive, too orthodox, too repressive, you effectively stem the flow of water. You stem the flow of kama. When that happens, you would get still water. And in still water grows bacteria, disease, distortions of human behavior. So Hindu society seems to be quite clear that to be too repressive on kama is also bad, is adharmic. Having said that, Hindu society is also clear that if the banks of dharma are too shallow, then kama will overspill into society, and society will become decadent and hedonistic. So the thinkers within Hindu civilization, sadhus, rishis, brahmins, acharyas, really fascinating. You can read these texts and you will see dialogue between the Kshatriya class, the ruling aristocracy and the rishis and the Brahmins, really fascinating dialogues. They're still recorded and they're being translated as we speak, where Hindu society, when it became far too dogmatic and rigid, the rishis were propounding a liberal philosophy. But when society became far too decadent, so for example, between the 6th century and the 10th century AD, religious sites like Rameshwaram, Somnath, had dancing girls employed in the hundreds by their kings and the aristocracy. And it was an aristocratic flavor. But the rishis and the Brahmins were totally against it. But it still happened for 400 years. And so people were going to these temples for, yes, religious worship, but actually there was a lot of sexual, it was an environment of I suppose, sexual gratification was being had there too. And women were being employed and paid for that gratification. This is within the religious garb. So you can see Hindu society has ebbed and flowed. And there's always a tension between the rishis and the Brahmins and the acharyas and the aristocracy and the Kshatriya class. You always sense this tension. When dharma is too rigid, I suppose, when society is too rigid, dharma forces us to liberalize. When we are too liberal and society becomes decadent, dharma allows us and gets us to think about becoming more disciplined. It begins to restrict certain behavior. So there's three things. Hindu civilization accepts, I find, is very accepting of the human condition. It's very accepting of the idea of sex work, but it never glorifies it. Hindu civilization, even in the Earth Shastra, which talks about it very candidly, it treats sex work almost like it's a hot plate. It's something to manage, it's something to be careful of, it's something that can be very, very damaging to society and individual flourishing and societal flourishing. But at the same time, you can't just suppress it and just shove it underground, because that too is damaging and destructive for society. So there's always this dialectic happening. So it's accepting but not glorifying. Number two is Hindu society has ebbed and flowed, and we are ebbing and flowing today, and we should have some say in that ebbing and flowing. What does our dharma tell us about how we should conduct ourselves? And I suppose the third and only final thing is to understand that the entire Hindu approach is that it has always been a tension that arises at the individual level. Hindu society has always had reformers. It has never become stagnant. It has always reformed itself in how it approaches sexual morality. And we are no different today. We are right now maintaining these very, very timeless issues. And they will always remain timeless. Future generations will be debating this too. You know, the question I suppose we have to ask is, how hedonistic are we in this society? If you believe we are too hedonistic, we should be orthodox. We should become more conservative. If you believe we are already too conservative and we are actually, suppressing, then obviously we will end up going and becoming even more liberal. But you notice it is for the individual and the society as a collective to discuss, to debate, to intrigue, to think, but dharma being the basis upon which you make your decisions, not your individual whim. And so the society as a collective is as important as the individual. So I've probably given you no answers, but I thought I would give you that insight in the short time that I had. Namaste, thank you.